Newman, System of Care Youth Facilitator in Nevada with Nevada PEP and Youth Move Nevada.
Hey, Eric. Do you have your top challenges you've experienced when doing outreach in your current role?
I would have to say one of them is transportation issues, getting youth here, and then really, especially in the early goings, getting them engaged early on, getting them excited about our efforts and wanting to be a part of Youth Move and things like that, engagement.
Yeah, absolutely.
My phone doesn't have a mute button, but is it *1 to mute?
That's a good question.
Yes, it is. *1 to mute, and then you just push *1 again to unmute.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Want to share their name, their role, their location, and the top challenges they've experienced when doing outreach, either via phone or, if you're not comfortable with that, via chat. A couple people typing in the chat box, but feel free to use the phone line as well. And for those of you that are just joining, Eric from Youth Move Nevada was just talking to us about how transportation and initial engagement are the top challenges he's experienced when doing outreach. Marika just typed in that her two biggest challenges are trying to find the right outreach mode, whether that's email or phone or social media, and the second one being when reaching out to groups that aren't chapters, assessing how much they already know about Youth Move National, so kind of where to start. That's a good point, Marika. So Linda and Catalina, I'm wondering if you both would be interested in using the phone line to give your name, your role, and your location, and also your top challenges you've experienced when doing outreach in your role. But first, I just wanted to give a little introduction to both of you, and just for everyone that's participating on the line right now, Catalina and Linda are going to be our co-hosts today talking about accessing hard-to-reach populations. So Catalina is the Executive Director for the Center for Community Learning, and her work focuses on providing training and technical assistance in the field of cultural and linguistic competence. When she's not working, she loves to run and watch football with her husband and two daughters. And Linda is a research assistant professor in the Department of Child and Family Studies at the University of South Florida, and she co-leads the Cultural and Linguistic Competence team of the Technical Assistance Network for Children's Behavioral Health. She is a socio-cultural anthropologist with research interests in behavioral health equity, accessibility of services, and resources for traditionally underserved communities, community development, and racial and ethnic identity formation. So that's just a little bit about them. And whichever one of you wants to kick us off with your name, role, location, and your top challenges you've experienced when doing outreach.
Sure. So this is Linda. Hi, everyone. And that was a really formal bio. And I like to also just read and watch TV with my family when I'm not working. But in my role as so I'm an anthropologist. I'm a professor and a researcher at the University of South Florida, and I've had the opportunity to do outreach in a variety of different settings. So I've had a lot of different challenges, and probably the biggest one that I'll say that I have faced is to just even kind of figure out who is the best person to first make contact with to kind of, get that sort of interest in whatever it is I'm reaching out about. So that has been sometimes, you get a little making cold calls in certain cases, or as an anthropologist, you have to go to communities sometime and to residents, knock on doors and try to figure out who's the best person to approach. And that always seems daunting in the beginning to me, even though I've done it quite a few times now. The other challenge we've experienced is also, transportation on the part of the folks that we're trying to reach and figuring out what's the best way to get to them as opposed to making them come to us, which is sometimes what we default to. So that's me. And I'll let Catalina introduce herself.
Thank you, Linda. And just as a reminder for everybody else that's on the call, making sure that if you're not talking, you're on mute so that we can reduce the amount of background noise. Catalina, if you want to chime in here, that would be awesome. Catalina, you might be on mute right now.
You're right, I'm on mute. Sorry.
No worries.
Yes, so as I said, I'm Catalina Booth, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Community Learning. And I am located in just west of Houston, Texas, in Katy, Texas. And as far as top challenges you've experienced when doing outreach in your role, well, my role does not include direct outreach, but what I have seen organizations struggle with is how to deal with youth and reaching out to youth from different cultures and figuring out the best outreach method that incorporates the youth culture, not just youth culture, but ethnic and other aspects of culture. And that's it.
Great. So we also have in the chat box here Rosalind from Youth Move Nevada out of Reno, and challenges she's experienced in outreach include transportation and scheduling conflicts. And we have Zach from Youth Move Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania System of Care Partnership, and his two challenges are transportation as well as technology. And Jackie, a youth engagement specialist from the National Indian Child Welfare Association in Portland, Oregon, and her challenges were finding the best way to contact youth and transportation for youth. We also have Corey from Youth Move Pennsylvania. He's a youth involvement specialist for Pennsylvania System of Care Partnership, and the two top challenges he identified were best ways to communicate with chapter effectively, and the other challenge is training new young leaders what Youth Move is and how they can support their chapter. We also have Sam Broderick, who is a freelance research/communications consultant on several projects, mostly based out of New Jersey and Boston, but physically located in Baltimore, Maryland. And the two biggest challenges that she's experienced are getting folks to put money behind the ideas of involving youth, and that even in systems that have involved youth for years, helping providers and policymakers see the value of youth involvement in research and program design.
Yeah.
And finally, we have Sarah Shepard, who is a youth engagement specialist for Paving the Way in Fort Worth, Texas. The challenges that she's experienced are transportation and sustainability. I also see that we have one more participant who is typing a response right now, and I would encourage everybody to continue using our chat box throughout the entire presentation, even if that's to introduce yourself if you're late to the game. But I think that we'll kind of get rolling here with these slides so we can make sure that we get to all the content that we have for you all. So on our next slide, we have the objectives of Direct Connect, which, just as a reminder for those of you who either have not been on at all or who haven't been on in a little bit, the objectives are developing professional and leadership skill sets, connecting as a community to gather and share new resources and ideas, uniting with other youth advocates and professional peers from across the country who are doing similar work. And with that being said, today we are lucky to have Catalina and Linda on the phone with us to talk to us about working with hard-to-reach populations. I would encourage everybody, like I said, to keep their lines muted if they're not speaking, to minimize background noise, and also to feel free to use the public chat box for anything if you all have questions while anyone's speaking or just need us to slow down. Feel free to let us know, and we're here for this time to be useful for you all. So however we can do that best, we're willing to do that. So just let us know. And Linda and Catalina, it's over to you guys.
Great, thank you. So just to kick the discussion off, we were thinking that we would start with a poll. So I'm going to ask Colin to put the poll up. Thanks. And so the question is, which one of these groups might be considered hard to reach? So if you would all take a moment and just take a quick answer there. Which one of these would you say represents someone who is hard to reach, or represents rather a group? That is hard to reach. And so we can see, let's see, are we pretty much? And if you have another response, feel free to type it in the chat box also, if you want to share something else. And Hannah, I just need you to guide me in terms of like time frame on the polls about when I should just close it out.
I think whenever you see the numbers stop fluctuating, so it looks like the numbers are pretty stable right now, and I think we're good to close it out.
Okay, great. So as you saw, thank you all for doing that. As you saw, we pretty much, we had a good distribution of responses, right? And as Samantha's pointed out in the chat box, no multi-select option, yes, most of these and others. This is kind of a trick question because pretty much every one of those folks could be considered a representative of a hard-to-reach population, even the one that no one really selected, which was a person, a Caucasian or white person. Because as we'll see, and I'm hoping that we can get into the discussion on, is that, you know, folks or populations become hard to reach for a variety of different reasons and as a result of multiple circumstances. So we did have some other responses which were really good as well. People who live in more rural communities, definitely. People who live in rural areas, incarcerated youth, youth with developmental disabilities, homeless youth. So you can see there are a whole variety of ways that we could identify populations or groups that are hard to reach. And so I'm just going to take us through. We have here, what do we mean when we say hard to reach? I think the first point that we want to make that we kind of see through that poll, right, is that, and let's see, I'm sorry, I didn't bring up actually our definition is not coming up, so I'm just going to read it to you. The definition that we have there should be, and it should be in the PowerPoint that you can download. Researchers, practitioners, and others use the term hard to reach to describe individuals or groups of people that a system or organization has trouble contacting or engaging in services, events, or other activities. Okay, so I know you can't see, but basically this is a great way to kind of illustrate what we mean. We're having trouble getting to the other side of that wall, right? And the definition, if we think about it, and I know that it's not there, so it's going to give us a little, pause, but the idea is that when we think about that definition, right, that researchers and providers generally give, if you look at like research literature, if you look at, or if you talk to a lot of providers, the term hard to reach is used because they themselves are having some sort of trouble contacting those folks, right? So there's an issue of an underlying problem is what I'm trying to point out here. And Catalina, feel free to jump in at any time if you want to emphasize any points or if you want to just add anything.
Okay, we'll do.
Thanks. So, let's dive in a little bit more to, thanks Hannah for typing the definition in the chat box, let's kind of unpack, as they say, or really kind of start to focus on what is that definition telling us. One of the things we know is that as there are many different groups that can be hard to reach, there are many different actually definitions if we look at research and what folks tell us in the field in terms of providers and other leaders of organizations or programs that are out there trying to get at folks. And one of the things we often see as well is that we see a lot of synonyms used for that hard to reach population. We also see a lot of use of the terms like vulnerable populations, marginalized populations, hidden populations. And there's a sense, again, that there's a problem, right? There's a problem that we're identifying. But as these researchers, Frymouth and Metger, noted way back in 1990, part of the problem might be that we're not defining our terms really well. So that might be one issue. But the other issue is what about the folks on the other end of that definition or that term, right? Hard to reach population. So what I'm trying to suggest is that, if we think about hard to reach, it evokes an idea in your head, right? That's the first thing if we close our eyes and I say hard to reach, a picture forms in your head, and it could be any one of these groups that we talked about or something else entirely, right? And so when we don't really define our terms, and we're all sort of out here trying to do good work, trying to get folks to use either our programs or engage in our activities, use services that they may very well need, but we're not really clear about what we're doing, it really can trip us up. So we have So Wilton just said in the chat box, for instance, that we call hard to reach population in Milwaukee opportunity youth, and we've seen that used in a variety of different locations with a variety of different programs, right? And I think that's great because it gets at that point of how do we make this, when you say hard to reach, are we sort of stigmatizing? Are we contributing to stigma or negatively ascribing to folks an idea about them? So that's part, we got to this slide to ask you all, what do you think when we are talking, when we're using terms, and I recognize, so one, I'll just say, as an anthropologist, we are among the best of them of making terms and using terms. Like we can get really, really precise with certain terms for populations that we deem sort of marginalized, hard to reach, traditionally underserved. We use subaltern, a whole bunch of terms that are really complex, right? But what about, again, those folks on the other end of that? And when we're trying to think about how to really engage with folks, how do we use language that can be a little bit more engaging, right, or friendly? And so we may use these terms, is one of the points I want to make here, is we may use these terms as, as colleagues or in our organizations, but it's probably not a good idea to go into communities using a lot of these terms.
And Linda, I would just stop to say here that the reason that maybe we use that term to begin with is because people know what we mean when we say that. Like, people in our line of work know what we mean. So when we're asking for topics that people want to know more about for Direct Connect, and we say opportunity youth, maybe people in our line of work don't necessarily know what that means, or it's not as easy to close your eyes and picture exactly what that would look like. But when we say hard to reach or traditionally underserved, then there's a better, mental image that comes with that. So not to say that hard to reach is a good phrase to use carrying over into actually doing this work on the ground, but that it serves its purposes for the people in this line of work who are trying to, picture what, the name for what it means for what the topic is for this Direct Connect.
Totally. And I get that. And that's part of what I think I was trying to say not so clearly. So I'll give you an example. I'm currently working on a project in Tampa, Florida, with folks that live in a community where, the income levels are extremely low. So when we sit around the table as researchers and talk about extreme poverty, we know, what we're talking about. There's a level of poverty that we're thinking of, and we get that picture in our head, right? And we're not necessarily using that and trying to be careful about using that in a way that is, negative or somehow using that against the folks we're actually trying to work with in order to see if we can't improve some conditions, right, around housing. However, we have been told by folks in the community that those, residents don't necessarily, some residents don't mind, some residents definitely don't want to hear about poverty and calling folks poor people. So I think the point is just hard to reach. It's kind of if you think about it, it's kind of a neutral term compared to sort of marginalized, let's say, because it has a little bit more of an emphasis. But I think any term, right? We are all pretty much at this point, I think, learning about how language can be used for good or for ill. And I think it's just important to recognize that. The other thing, as a researcher, you can't measure what you don't define. So if you have identified that folks are hard to reach in some way, then how do you know you're reaching them? What are the strategies you're going to use to reach them? So that's just sort of what we wanted to just kind of jump off with, to kind of think about how we use the language and how we're going to define certain populations. So moving on, one of the things that we wanted to do was to start to ask these questions, right? If we're thinking about So everyone gave their sort of challenges in outreach, and so we all are doing outreach in some way, shape, or form. Initially, before we even start to go out there, we want to start to ask these questions and really start to come up with some good concrete answers that will help guide our work once we go out into the community to try to reach folks and engage them in whatever it is that we're trying to do, right? So, the first question, what do we know about people's lack of interactions with service systems, with our programs, with our organization? Do we know anything about why folks aren't interacting or aren't responding to our efforts? And a lot of the answers that we got in the chat originally are pretty good, because if we think about it, those of us that have worked in rural areas of counties or states, we know that oftentimes services or different organizations will not be located in those areas. And so folks, if they don't have a reliable means of transportation to get to the city or wherever it is, they can be at a real disadvantage in terms of accessing the things that they need. So that would be one clear example of what we know about why certain people may not interact with our, organizations, services, and or systems. And then we want to kind of take a step back and think about why we're trying to reach them, and really think about what is the, where is the point of buy-in for the folks that you're going to go out and interact with? What is the benefit to them to engage with whatever it is you're offering? And finally, how do we approach the diverse groups we're trying to reach? So I'm hoping that through this discussion, we'll start to talk about some of these strategies, right? About how we go about addressing some of these barriers that we're starting to identify. Does anyone else have any questions or things that they want to share or add in terms of kind of getting the mind and body ready to go out there and do outreach? Okay. So let's think some more about why folks don't engage with the, our whatever it is we're offering, right? If we think about those questions we just talked about, and we are, a lot of times with the best of intentions, I've worked on projects and in organizations where we've developed things, and it's kind of like the sense of, if you build it, they will come. And that's not necessarily the case, right? Again, you could have the best of intentions and design the best program you possibly think you could, or the best activity, and somehow, just it's not connecting. It's not connecting. A lot of the times when we talk about how or why folks don't participate, the social determinants of health are really important, right? Because we're talking about, oftentimes, when I think of hard to reach populations, and I think a lot of the responses that you all gave really touched on this. They were groups of people that for some reason have a challenge or a barrier to that kind of inhibits their ability to engage, right? Whether that's really conscious or unconscious. So how many of you are familiar with the social determinants of health? I don't know if you can raise your hands on this or you want to say, but if you haven't seen this, the social determinants of health gives us an opportunity to look at the diverse factors that affect health, including behavioral health and overall well-being, right? And as you'll see on this on the slide, right? If you go in the middle in that red circle where it says age, sex, and constitutional factors, that's really referring to more things that are kind of associated with biology. So our age, our sex, and constitutional factors meaning like our makeup, our profile, it could be genetics, hereditary, things that we inherit from our family, and how in the old days they used to say your constitution, whether you're a generally healthy person or not, right? And so those are the things that are most associated with biology with regard to your health or behavioral health, right? But as you start to move outward on this half circle, you start to see all the other factors that really engage with that, with your biology. So one of the things that we often say, I don't know how many of you have heard this, but like your zip code is going to affect your health more than your biology. What we're learning, those of us that study, health, public health, and behavioral health, is that where you live, your zip code is probably going to have a greater influence on your overall health and well-being than these factors in the center. And why is that? Because in addition to individual lifestyle factors, which are kind of things that we associate with choices we make, like smoking or driving, risky driving, other risky behaviors or not risky behaviors, you are also affected. Those affect your biology, right? Those choices you make. Everyone's probably heard that if you smoke, you have a higher risk of certain diseases. But as you move beyond that, what your community looks like, who you have in your life to give you support, all of those things that seem far removed from the biology. Now we're talking about the general. As we move beyond that, the socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental conditions, all of those things play a key role in your health. So if you're looking at, let's say, some of them seem pretty they just make sense. So agriculture and food production. If you don't have access to food, it's going to be difficult for you to stay healthy, different foods. However, we know that in certain communities we have what are called food deserts, right? Because for a variety of different reasons, we don't have access to food in those neighborhoods. They could be a lot of times we think of urban neighborhoods that don't have a variety of supermarkets, let's say, or markets that sell produce, right? So that would be one example. But there are other examples in terms of housing, in terms of in terms of discrimination, in terms of looking at your access to education. All of these different things begin to play a role, and your socioeconomic level, in how you're able to interact with the world around you. And so at the end of the day, all of this is to say that a lot of folks, when we think of in research as folks that are having difficult engaging in services or programs, I start to identify barriers. And these barriers are oftentimes socially caused. So I hope that was clear. And if anyone has a question, just kind of jump in, unmute your line, or throw in the chat your question. So besides that, so that what I'm saying here in terms of the social determinants is that the world around us plays a very important role, and that means the social environment and the physical environment plays a super important role in how we connect with others and with programs and with organizations and systems. And so it's really important for us to keep that in mind as we start to think about who it is that we're trying to reach, and why it is that they may be having issues. So now we have a video just to kind of highlight another aspect of why folks may have difficulty engaging. And this video has to do with intersectionality. And I'll just ask Colin to load it. It's a 3-minute video.
Yep, so I'm actually going to hop on and explain the small transition we're going to have right now. So for everyone listening in who is on a phone line, what you're going to need to do is mute your phone line, unmute your computer speakers, because the audio for this video is only going to play over the computer. So we'll give everyone a minute or two to go ahead and do that. Again, if you have your phone unmuted while you're playing it on your computer, that's going to create a huge echo for everyone. So just make sure your phone line is muted and your computer speakers are unmuted for the video. Once it finishes, you can switch right back. Sorry for any inconvenience this causes for anyone who's listening. I know it's a little wonky, but that's just how we have to have it set up in order to get the audio out to all of you. So I'm going to let this load and give everyone another minute or two to make that transition. If you're having any issues or questions, go ahead and chime in on the chat. I'll make sure that we leave enough time to get you transitioned before we start playing the video. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, make sure our phone is muted, computer speakers are unmuted, and at the end you can go ahead and switch that and we'll get back to the presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Intersectionality. Have you heard this word before? Even if you have, you might not know what it means. Let's take a look at it. The first part's easy enough. Intersection, a place where things come together. Intersectionality refers to the reality that we all have multiple identities that intersect to make us who we are. It also gives us a way to talk about oppressions and privileges that overlap and reinforce each other. This term dates back to the 1980s and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She noticed that we didn't have an effective way to talk about how the experiences of black women are different from the experiences of black men and of white women. How? Black women endure both gender discrimination and racial discrimination. Over the last 30 years, scholars, educators, and activists have expanded the use of the word intersectionality to talk about identities beyond race and gender. Let's look at a few examples. Jerry has a disability, and his family lives below the poverty line. He is the oldest of 10, which requires him to do a lot of caregiving and sometimes keeps him out of school. No one in the school counseling office has talked to Jerry or his parents about his plans for after graduation. He has applied for several jobs, but never gets called back. Fatima is Muslim and recently came to the United States from Somalia. She finds that many people at her school make assumptions about her values and abilities before they speak to her. Many of her classmates think she shouldn't be at their school at all. Greta comes from an affluent family. Both her parents and grandparents went to college, and her father owns a successful business. She doesn't think about her identity very often, but she does think of herself as someone who will go to college and get a good job once she graduates. Think about Greta's situation as opposed to Fatima's or Jerry's. Fatima and Jerry are members of marginalized groups. They don't get to choose whether or not to think about their identities. Greta, on the other hand, can ignore intersectionality if she wants to. Life isn't the same for everyone, even for people who share identity characteristics. By adopting an intersectional lens, we have a better opportunity to understand why and to change the institutions that help and harm us based on who we are. Want to learn more? Read our story, Teaching at the Intersections, in the summer 2016 issue of Teaching Tolerance magazine.
going to hop back on and again explain for everyone who'd like to participate via the phone line. You can now go ahead and I would first mute your computer speakers and then unmute your phone line just to avoid any kind of an echo. Again, mute your computer speakers, unmute your phone line, and we should be good for the rest of the presentation. Thank you, everyone who went through that transition. I know it can be a little bit of a pain in the butt, but we appreciate your patience and flexibility.
Great, thank you, Colin. So we included that video, which is pretty short. I think it gives you a good idea of some of the ways in which cultural identity and the various aspects of cultural identity can also play a role in how folks approach service systems and or organizations and other efforts where we're trying to engage with them. So again, this we just wanted to stop and consider, how the different ways in which we kind of approach life based on how we identify, and all the different aspects of our identity can serve to also shape the ways in which we interact with the world based on what we see as our opportunities or lack thereof. And I know, intersectionality is used quite a bit these days, and that we hear the term a lot. And the idea also, I think that's important to take away, and I know Hannah just posted something in the chat, is that, identities are not, you all probably have heard this and probably know this, but identities aren't static, and they're not written in stone, and no one aspect of our identity really ever defines who we are. I mean, we make those determinations a lot of times as individuals, and that diversity in human life is sort of the rule of thumb. Just responding to the question here that Hannah posted, would you say that intersectional identities make it even more difficult to access services? I think in some cases, as the video showed, there are some groups that are forced to think about identity in ways because the larger society outside, and this goes back to that illustration of the social determinants, right? That identity is often what we call in anthropology and other social sciences ascribed to us. It's given to us by the outside world, and that's very much tied to processes in society that can make opportunities or take those away, right? And when we talk about marginalized, we're talking about groups that have less access precisely because of how they're defined in society.
And similarly to what, on a more practical basis, and I think Samantha brought up a good point on the chat box, that sometimes we identify for visible identity. So traditionally we've defined culture as just race and ethnicity, and we could make judgment calls just based on the fact of how people look, their skin color, their eyes, or other physical factors. And I think intersectionality points out the fact that people, someone may be Hispanic but may identify more with a different cultural group because there's different parts of that individual's culture that are important to them. For example, personal example, in college, I'm Hispanic, but I also happen to be a person of faith, and I identified more with a specific community of faith than I did with the Hispanic student groups, because my culture and my identity is much more than just my ethnic background, and I think that's what often makes it more of a challenge to reach people, because we often define culture and on limited factors instead of taking the broader reach of culture.
Hello?
Yes, I temporarily got bumped off. I'm back. So sorry.
Hi, sorry. This is Linda. I also got bumped off and I couldn't dial into the chat to say that I did, so I'm back. So just wanted to, sorry about that. Thanks, Catalina and Sam for adding. All right, so any other questions or points before we move on? We're going to move into the portion of the discussion that's focused on how, what strategies we can use to engage with folks. And I think we have a little bit of an issue again with our slides. So the basic question here would be, how well does your organization, your system, your program, your chapter understand the folks that you're trying to reach? That's the first thing that we need to address. And one of the key things when we talk about how to begin engagement, if we don't know the response, if we don't have a ready response to that question, then we need to do some digging. We need to do some learning and gather some information that will help us to better learn who exists in our community, what are the different groups, and which groups in particular are having issues connecting, right? Or we're having issues connecting with. So the 2 points on here are, one would be a good recommendation to do some sort of needs assessment to better understand the community, the different groups in the community, what their interactions have been in the past with systems and organizations, et cetera, and also try to start to kind of identify those social determinants. And then the other thing that we would say is like to look at assets and have folks that you are working with or you're trying to reach, at least some representatives, to get you an idea of what are the positive things in the community. Every community has leaders, every community has assets. And so working with folks and trying to make those connections, or at least having, in anthropology, when we try to break into a community, we often identify an informant is what we call it, and someone who can, a key informant who can help, guide us and kind of give us some of this information from their perspective and maybe start to introduce us to folks. But if you already have made a little bit of headway in a particular community, then working with folks to get some idea of not just the needs, but the assets in that community, that will start to, help you develop a real good picture of who folks are, what's available, what's not available, and how you can better tailor what you're trying to do to their needs. So in the next slide, I'm just throwing this out here. I'm not sure how relevant this is to everyone, but the Behavioral Health Disparities Impact Statement is something that SAMHSA requires of, I think, just about all of their grantees at this point. And it's a way to begin to identify populations or groups that are facing some sort of disparity or disproportionality. That is, that they're overrepresented or underrepresented in a particular service or system, and that it helps you to kind of identify who specifically those folks are with regards to race, ethnicity, LGBT status, and other forms of identity, often age. And did you want to add anything here, Catalina?
We've been chatting on the chat box for those that haven't been looking, and we're thinking of different ways of how to think about the role identity plays in program access and services. And Wilton had an excellent point that the cultural iceberg is a good way of viewing that, and how there's so much more that lies beneath the surface that we need to look at in order to help increase access to services and other accessibility factors.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just now seeing the chat, and I also saw that Marika asked, do you think that how we identify can change over time or situationally? And I would say most definitely in terms of, yes, most definitely. And that folks, you know, and this is part of what I have done in terms of research and study, is that it can change over time or even depending on, you know, different circumstances. So you may, I don't know, highlight, I think the example that Catalina gave was excellent in that way. And then that the cultural iceberg exercise is an excellent way that you could start to think about the way identity does, the role identity plays in all of this, which would be another presentation or discussion. So just very quickly, I'm going to go, this is just an example of like a worksheet that we had, so that folks in systems of care in particular that focus on children, youth, and young adult behavioral health can use once they've done this behavioral health disparities impact statement, which is kind of a more deeper level of needs assessment with regards to mental health services, and sort of just see how you could identify the different populations in a community, and then kind of develop baseline goals that you would put in there in terms of number. Like, I want to reach X amount of people. I know I have X amount of people in my community, and I want to reach X amount of people of this group and that group. So this is just one example of that's been used in various communities and states around the country. So Hannah just posted a picture in terms of where would youth coordinators start. Do you mean with the behavioral health impact disparity impact statement, or in a needs assessment? Okay, so this is an excellent question. Thanks, Hannah. And the rest of these slides, we have some other strategies that are, we pulled from best practices, from the research, from our colleagues on the CLC team. And some of them may not directly apply to you. So you may not be the one that is designing the needs assessment. But, I would argue, and that's why I often say, like, service, organization, chapter, even an activity or a program, you can kind of tailor, right, to start to think about, like, who's out there, who's my audience that I'm trying to engage with, who am I trying to connect with, what do I know about them, and what's the best way of connecting is one, right? So that's but you may not be in the position to sort of direct some of that activity, but you may be that person that's out there in the community that's really on the ground doing that work. So one of the key ways to start this is to bring back what you learn and what you know of the communities to the folks in your organization that are responsible for designing these things. That would be my suggestion. Catalina, did you want to add anything?
Yes, and I think on a more one-on-one example, there's a new member of your organization, or you're trying to reach out to a specific group. You need to tackle the conversation about culture. You might see somebody in a burqa and assume where they're from or what their situation is, but I think sometimes engaging in conversations about culture and asking questions about culture are very important. And it's not a conversation that you can start on day one. I think you have to build a repertoire of trust first, and then ask questions about, their culture, their background, and how that influences how they might access your services or how they might engage. You might learn that, because of their beliefs, they can't attend any meetings or participate in activities on a particular day of the week, or they can't have certain food, or they would like certain accommodations. But if you don't have that conversation, they may never tell you these things, and that might be a barrier. So learning new ways to communicate about culture beyond race and ethnicity are going to be very helpful.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think also the other question that Hannah posed was how do we get started in terms of identifying assets? And so what I would say is when I was working at a community-based organization and we did needs assessment and asset identification, what we did was we had everyone in the organization involved, and then we reached out to folks in the community, leaders, who would then identify other folks in the community that could work with us. So we actually had community residents as data collectors, right? And so I would say that everyone can start a needs and an asset identification in particular by just getting a map of your local neighborhood and identifying what you think are assets, right? And we kind of did this exercise with various level, everybody in the organization. So we had every level of staff in the organization do this. And then you start to see that depending on perhaps where you live, where you drive by, what your position is, you see certain things, you don't see other things, and you may identify something as an asset that other folks may think like, why would you identify that as an asset? And that begins a conversation right there. And then you have the residents do it, and you start to pull together all these different responses so you have a visual map of what the assets are. And it can be very revealing, you know what I mean? Because as I said, folks may identify things that you yourself would not identify, and then it forces you to have that conversation about, you know, different sort of even values in terms of what you do in your community or what you see in your community every day. And I see that we're having a chat. We just have like a couple more slides in terms of really just some points that we would recommend, you know, in terms of engaging with folks. Always, you know, if you haven't already, strive to identify local leaders. Like I said, every community, every neighborhood has a leader, and it's not necessarily someone who's in a formal position of leadership. It can be, you know, a grandmother, an auntie sitting out on the front stoop that knows who's coming, who's going, and that people go to for information. That's a leader. There are organizations that, for instance, if we work in behavioral health like Catalina and I do, we may be called upon to engage or partner with organizations that have nothing to do with behavioral health, like a social club, for instance, or an ethnic club. Both organizations that already have a big network in the community, that have developed trust over time, and that can not represent folks, but that can serve almost as gatekeepers to help you and be those key informants. And the other key thing is to really use snowball sampling. You meet one person, have them introduce you to someone else, and start to build networks that way. Always sort of, you know, and whatever you're doing, if you can do this, recruit folks to work with you on committees or from the beginning, so that you're getting that feedback and perspective and real, you know, engagement from the start, not simply design something and then say, here's what we got, what do you think? Let's see what else. Some of these other strategies are we pulled from, as I said, literature and best practices, but they may seem sort of not necessarily focused for youth coordinators. And so I think we're having a really lively chat in the discussion in the chat box. So I'd like to kind of turn it over to Hannah and see what actually, we have one last point that I'd like to make is that remember always that when you're working with human beings that, you know, we're diverse and we should expect and respect that diversity, always, always, right? Just because someone identifies as part of any group doesn't mean that that group and everyone that is part of that group is homogeneous. When we're talking about really going out to reach and connect with folks that we that are not necessarily responding to our initial overtures, we may have to go out and be in the community more than is you know, anticipated, and that may have some implications for staff who need to drive to locations that are far away, and so those conversations need to be had in the in organizations, right? And finally, you know, one of the things that is super important, and probably those of you affiliated with Youth Move chapters know for a fact, is that you have to be creative with the type of events and activities that you provide, and to, you know, if you can provide some sort of incentive for folks. For a lot of us, you know, we get paid for our time when we're out here doing these things, but not the residents, not the people that we're trying to reach. So I think that it's really important. And these are some things that we may not necessarily, the two and three, bullet 2 and 3 are things that we may not necessarily have all the control over, but it's worth advocating for these things and pushing for these things when we have to. And so I will turn it over to Hannah at this point so that we can continue the discussion.
Awesome, and thank you so much, Linda, for taking the time today to present on Direct Connect and to answer the questions that have been coming up in the chat box. And I would just ask you one final question for you and Catalina, which is if you had to say like maybe 3 action steps that people might take once they get off this webinar and feel inspired to try and incorporate the information that we've just talked about, what might those be? I mean, I know the last few slides were kind of points to consider, but what might some action steps be for people that are in the youth coordinator role and maybe don't have you know, the ability to go out and, like I said, do a needs assessment or really make a bunch of changes in their systems, like by themselves? What might be 3 things?
Linda, if I could go first, because I have to hop off right after I say a short bit. Kids are getting out of school. But I would think that what I would do if I were in the shoes of many of you would be to identify a person either through my work as a youth coordinator or Youth Move or working with youth or youth advocate that I would ideally like to be more engaged in the services, or who you think would benefit from the services, and engage them in a conversation, build a relationship, and engage them in a conversation about culture and how their culture, broadly defined, not just the superficial levels, impacts how they view the organization, how they view the services, and how they would access services. I think starting those conversations would be informative, and it also teaches you how to begin those conversations.
Yeah. I would even say, yeah, if you're the youth coordinator and you're interacting with youth in your system and you have access to folks, then to first begin talking with folks, even very generally, and start to work with them to get a sense of what, you know, needs and assets are. And, you know, think about ways of just in your own work, how you kind of understand what you see out there, what's the lay of the land, and kind of present that to folks that you're talking to youth in your system, and get a sense from them of where you may be kind of mistaken, where you are, have that conversation. I think those conversations are super valuable because they can start to, point you in the directions that you may need to go in terms of doing this work and this outreach. Now, if you're not in a position to do some of this stuff, the other, I would say, is to find, allies and mentors in the system that you work with that are willing to support you and the work that you do. And I know that that's very difficult to do just from experience that I've had working with systems around the country, and if as a, at the youth level in particular, sometimes, it's a challenge to kind of, I think someone made that comment early on about, getting folks to support the importance of real youth, real meaningful participation of youth in systems, right? And building towards youth-guided systems. I mean, that's a tough sell sometimes for providers, for people in power in systems, right? But to try to make those relationships with mentors and or other folks that support you in the system, it's like a community within the work that we do, right, and within the organizations as well, and try to build those networks so that you can advocate, and then they can have your back and advocate as well. And I think being able, talking to youth and getting a sense of what the needs and the assets are, and then bringing that back to folks starts to paint a picture for them about why, maybe certain activities are important, and getting out there in the community is important. So thank you all. Thank you, Hannah, for inviting Catalina and me to Direct Connect.
Yeah, and I'm also just wondering if anybody else that's on the line, any of the participants that joined us today, have any questions for Linda or for Catalina, or for other people that are on the call with us right now, or any kind of takeaways that they might have from today's presentation. Maybe more follow-up questions about action steps that they might take in their own communities to bring up this topic of, like, air quotes, hard to reach populations, and how they might bring that to, the people that are above them, and make it a point of conversation to really spark that discussion and try to light some fires under some people so that we can continue to make this a priority. Also, just a note that Marika and Samantha shared 2 resources in the chat box that I think might be really great for everyone to check out if they're interested in this topic and interested in reading more. And I think Linda and Catalina might have some other resources to share with us. And when we get the recording of this Direct Connect, I will be sure to send it out to everybody, all of the participants today. And I'll be sure to include any resources as well.
Yes, thank you for sharing those resources. I'm just now seeing them, and some of the examples of using camera to identify needs and assets. Those are awesome examples and great resources.
So I think that, Eric and Rosalind, you guys had both talked about Nevada maybe starting to engage with the juvenile justice system and the young people that have been involved in it. And I was wondering if you have any questions maybe for Linda or Catalina about specifics to your community and how to go about that. That's a really good point, Eric. So I don't know, Linda and Catalina, if you've heard about Youth Move National's What Helps, What Harms initiative, but essentially it is a focus group type activity with a bunch of young people defining the things in their community that have kind of served them to get to where they are or to become successful, and then also the things that really need improvement and that created a barrier for them and challenged them to be successful. And I think that that's a really good point, and that's one kind of way of asset mapping as a youth coordinator, Eric. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's really great having those types of conversations with young people is one of the ways to have this type of discussion, but at a different level, maybe not at the same level as some of our supervisors, but being able to contribute to this asset mapping and readiness assessment.
Yeah, and even to the needs, right? Because I think a lot of times when providers or professionals think about needs, like researchers or providers, they often, it goes back to kind of like that initial point we were discussing where it's like this deficit-based model, like this person or this group has a need, right? But really what it can highlight, these types of conversations, are the gaps in services or resources or supports. So I think that that's really, really important. And I don't know, I haven't ever been involved with a What Helps What Harms group, but it sounds like a kind of like a focus group that would be really, really useful.
Yeah, I think a lot of our chapters have had a lot of success in using the results to showcase to their community as well as like their state legislature, and even advocating for national policy changes based on the feedback that they received during that focus group. So I think it's been really greatly successful and impactful. I see also a few names like Amanda from Virginia and Corey and Zach and Lex from Pennsylvania. And I wonder if you guys have any questions about specific situations that you all are experiencing either in Virginia or Pennsylvania in terms of trying to engage or outreach with populations that you might not have outreached or engaged with in the past, and any questions you might have about that. I also see that Eric and Samantha are typing.
So there was a question about the comment about needs assessment to identify service gaps clarification. So no, I'm not saying that that's the purpose of identifying needs. I think that what I was trying to convey is that when we think about, it's kind of like what we were saying in the beginning, that how we define and where our vantage point can color the way we think about things. And sometimes when in a conversation such as the what helps, what harms, where you have a discussion on both, you can start to really not just identify needs on the part of the community, but what are some gaps, what's missing in terms of the service system, which is not what providers always want to hear. Does that make sense?
I think that definitely makes sense. I think also those conversations are, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Samantha. Sometimes it's easier to talk. It's just that sort of system of care value around, a need does not equal a requirement for a service. And I think sometimes as practitioners, and even from connecting, just because we identify a need doesn't mean we actually need to create something. Sometimes it's just a matter of connecting existing informal or formal supports to a population that may not be accessing it, or the people, right? Like, I think we sometimes jump into the let's fix this by creating a new thing rather than recognizing that even on a practice level, that sort of value around, that wraparound value of not conflating needs with services is still important. Just because a community has a need doesn't mean we should be creating a service for it.
Yeah, definitely.
The solution may be something other than a service, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And it may mean to, connect different groups that haven't been connected or whatever, kind of identifying what it is. But yeah, definitely not suggesting that just create a service, but really kind of understanding things in a larger context.
I think that's also where the asset mapping might be really useful, because a lot of times, like Linda was saying, an asset to an asset identified by one person might not be a service. It might be something that, you know, people overlook, but actually is a successful approach or strategy that can be used to kind of meet a need that isn't a service that we're creating.
Yeah, definitely.
So Eric from Nevada is saying that there are real transportation issues when it comes to Nevada because it's so rural. And I'm wondering if if Catalina or Linda or anybody else on the call has any suggestions about or any solutions that they've used to overcome challenges related to transportation in a large and rural state.
So that is always a huge challenge, and when you say transportation, you mean transportation for the folks that you're working with or transportation for staff?
So I think staff are usually okay to yeah, but so for the folks that they're working.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough challenge, and I haven't worked in large rural states or states that have really large geographic sections that are rural. But so we, you know, trying to be creative. I mean, it's really tough on staff because on the staff side sometimes because the organization or your boss may not have the insurance to cover you driving people or they may not provide you, depending on the size of your organization, with mileage, all these different things. So those are really big challenges. And I don't necessarily have, you know, the best advice for what to do in terms of if you're in a place where it doesn't offer that, because those are huge challenges. Some of the things that we have seen in places is for like the so like a youth move chapter or a Federation of Families chapter will provide bus passes and transportation support to folks that are going to attend an event or attend one of their things. And so it's really tough, you know, if your organization can do that sort of thing, that requires thinking about, you know, it all the time and including it in your grants and your budgets so that you can help folks out. And part of the, you know, that was part of the point where with this last bullet here, where you may have to get creative, then that puts the onus on staff to get out there and travel and either if they don't have their own transportation, take public transportation, which would be very difficult in rural areas, I understand. So that's definitely a challenge we see, not just in rural areas, but in, you know, in cities where if the folks that we are working with don't have, you know, access for whatever reason, where cost is a factor. I currently live in Miami. We have horrible public transportation. You know, it's not something that it's not a system that has been really well thought out or that has been funded really well, and so that's a major issue. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in there. I wish I had something better to say, but you know, it kind of, that's where the folks that are in leadership positions or that can somehow, you know, have an influence on grant writing and the funding and the budget to make sure that that's always there. So.
Yeah, like for us in Nevada, I unmuted my line. We have some families in the northern Nevada area that will drive 150 miles to the office and back, you know, to have a meeting. You know, if they're able to do that and, you know, they really need our services, they'll travel 150 miles to our office.
And do folks get compensated? Like, do they get mileage or gas covered?
You know, since I've never been up at that office, I don't know if they do that. There might be something that they can provide them, like some kind of stipend or some credit, but as far as I know, I don't believe they do that. And then there are times where we will actually go out to them. So we will make the drive out there, and we kind of go around and we'll check on our families and youth and things like that. So we do make those efforts too, and that, of course, will be covered. But so we do that outreach too. So something like that can be modified, I think, for down south where a lot of the activity has been. There's likely options for us to get out there more to the youth that need it. That's stuff we're always brainstorming.
And even
Eric,
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, it just popped into my mind, one of the things that I've heard, in other communities, folks do is have satellite, I've seen presentations on where they have but still, someone's still having to travel to all those locations, right, where you have satellite locations where folks can meet, so they don't have to go too far out of their community to that this wouldn't, and in their community, and then the whoever's doing all the traveling, it's staff people will then coordinate one meeting in the state as opposed to somebody driving all the way around, so that you almost have little satellites in the various parts of the state where folks meet and possibly set up an outpost, so to speak, of where services or supports or whatever other things are being done there, and that requires a lot of interfacing and collaborating with, like we had said earlier, non-traditional organizations, and then someone is always going to have to report back to the larger whoever's having to do that. But it's very, it's very complex. I mean, this is something that's an issue around the country for a variety of different reasons. So Michael, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. No, I was just going to say that. So Michael in Miami was saying that he's set up meetings in different locations with maybe a meeting in the north, one in the south, and one downtown, and kind of understanding and expecting that not everyone will be able to be present at all of the meetings, but that they'll be offered in a variety of different locations. And Marika and I were actually just down in Texas doing some on-site technical assistance with our Youth Move chapter there, and they were talking a lot about this same issue, just that transportation is a huge problem for them because of such a large state, and the Youth Move chapter is statewide. And so the youth group doesn't get to meet as often, nearly as often as they would like to, so the face-to-face time that they have is very valuable. But as we were kind of chatting with them, we were talking about how Youth Move National is also, an organization where we work remotely in our own homes, and so we have to use a lot of different platforms to communicate with each other virtually. And so obviously that's not always ideal, and it's, there's a lot of exploring to do, and sometimes it's not very comfortable. I'm still trying to get behind the, Skyping or Google Hangouts or, doing the whole face-to-face but on a computer type meetings. But I would encourage everybody to leverage the resources and the technology that are kind of at your fingertips. And though it might not be the best or the first thing that you would want to do or the best way that you would want to do it, it's definitely an option.
Definitely. And we have some of those capabilities here for Skyping and web chatting and stuff, so we've utilized them in the past.
So Michael's saying that some youth have live Snapchatted other youth into meetings. That's awesome. So yeah, just getting creative about how people can be incorporated even if they physically cannot be at a meeting or wherever a service is being provided. Just really thinking outside the box. I think that's really great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to be respectful of everyone's time. And in the event that anybody does have questions, they can feel free to email me at the email address found on this slide. And definitely stay tuned for details about April's Direct Connect convening. We hope that you all are able to join us for that as well. And like I said, when I get the recording of this webinar, I will send it out with some resources and also hopefully more details about the topic of April's Direct Connect and also the date that it will be held on. And like I said, definitely feel free to email me any questions that might come up. And a huge round of applause and thank you to Linda and Catalina for being our hosts today and giving us so much information to think about and so much great content. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We appreciated your having us.
Yeah, definitely. We hope to collaborate more in the future, and thanks to everyone who joined us today. I hope you all have a good day.
Thank you, guys.